There we go. Good morning, everyone. If I could kindly ask you to take some seats, and we'll get moving forward with this panel. My name is Dale Morris, born and raised in Pittsburgh, a water city. Worked on the Hill for a number of years, doing policy work, budget, tax, and trade. Worked for the Netherlands Embassy for over 20 years, coordinating for the last 15 years, the Dutch government's water management, resiliency, flood risk reduction efforts in the US. And since May 1st, I am now working with, proudly with, the Water Institute of the Gulf here in Louisiana. There's a lot of great things happening, a lot of partnerships that have been made and need to continue to be made, and I want to be part of that. Our topic this morning is really what's going on elsewhere. We have these great 10X cities from Los Angeles through the heartland, the southern heartland of the US, over to Jacksonville. But there are a lot of other things, good things happening elsewhere in the US, and there are some huge challenges. And we Americans, we have a bias. We look inside the US, and often American city livers look only, people who live in the cities, they look only in their own cities. And there are tremendous examples that we can follow and mimic and learn from elsewhere. And that's the focus of this panel. Unique challenges, but challenges also that may be familiar to us. The topic, of course, is water. And as the 10X as the 10X conference program suggests, sometimes there's too much and sometimes there's too little. And I think we're going to hear stories about too polluted, and maybe that's for next year's version. And as I've traveled around the US, I've been in Boston and New York and Norfolk and Tampa and Charleston and Miami and Houston and New Orleans and San Francisco and Los Angeles and Seattle and St. Louis. And all those cities have problems of too much water, often too little water, and often polluted water. So we need to think of that. And I'm of a dual mind here. Sometimes I wake up and I think, wow, there are a lot of awesome things happening in these cities to deal with resiliency. And the next moment I think, wow, there are a lot of people and human capital and economic capital and ecosystems at risk, and we're not doing enough. And I think we heard yesterday, we can engineer and design our ways out of these problems. We are smart enough to do that. We have the money to do that if we would just allocate it. But sometimes we don't have the will. And I think that's a challenge. And we can look elsewhere here, and maybe we can be inspired by some will that we're going to see elsewhere. A lot of great things are happening. Just down in New Orleans, we have, Jeff Hebert was here, but he talked about it yesterday. The Lafitte Corridor, the Gentilly Resilience District, the Mirabeau Water Garden. In Houston, Kinder showed that fantastic map of Houston, of all the bayous, and the Bayou Greenway 2020 project. That is a crown jewel that a lot of other places need to know about and then emulate, because it is a wonderful system, and the bayous worked very well, notwithstanding all of that water that fell there. Sims Bayou retrofit. There's very little flooding on Sims Bayou during Hurricane Harvey, simply because of all the work that had previously been done. The Green City Clean Waters program in Philadelphia, a fantastic program. Didn't have the best start, but it is now implementing, and fantastic. In resilience, rebuild by design and resilience by design. Here's Rockefeller coming in, trying to scale up the linking of these cities so that they share things together. And that's because Rockefeller saw post-Katrina this tremendous need to link these experts together. And London and Singapore and Queensland, Ho Chi Minh City, Jakarta, Bangkok, Myanmar, all these places have water challenges and things we can learn from. So I'd like to turn the panel over, or turn the microphone over to Karel. Karel's going to talk about things happening in the Netherlands, and then we'll go to Sebastian, and then Arnoldo, and they'll talk about things happening in Paris and Mexico City, and then we'll have a conversation. And I would ask Karel and Sebastian Arnoldo to briefly introduce themselves, so you can refer to their bio in the program.
So my name is Karel Heynert, and yeah, unlike maybe the people in the two sessions that were here, I'm just a water person. I'm a civil engineer, so the classic type of person. The people that normally would decide what we do about flood management, but times have changed, and I think in a good way. I still have to get used to that, but yeah, I have a few slides. I'm not going to give you a kind of complete picture of what we do in the Netherlands. I just want to talk about a few things that, yeah, that are changing, or that I see are changing, and tell you a bit of the way we think about water management, and you see differences with, for example, discussions yesterday. Might be good for the discussion. So, a few pictures here, like everywhere. You were talking about Irma, Harvey, Katrina. We also had our big flood, and which then put us on a track of systematically trying to protect our country. So we are protecting our country after the '53 flood against big events. So high levees and low frequency big events. And today actually the focus has shifted. There's more focus on okay, still we do the big events, but there's trends coming up. Sea level rise is there, but also if you look at the population, economy, things are changing in the country, and you have to adapt to that. Also to be yeah, more anticipating to high frequency, lower events. Yeah, might be up for debate. Big events, it's about resilience, and you see communities, if they have some wells, they can recover, but high frequency, low event kills the economy at a certain point in time. Sea level rise, if we're not careful, will do that. People will move away. Okay. Maybe I can say it here, I could say it somewhere else. Holland, well, you wonder why Holland, because it's not on the I-10, but I was thinking, could we somehow connect that over Paris to Amsterdam, maybe Moscow, and then the other way around to Los Angeles? But so Holland, maybe one of the most unsustainable countries in the world, but I told you I'm a civil engineer, and we're Dutch, so we're going to stay there for a few hundred years more, until sea level rise may force us out. But in the meantime, we don't look at a long picture. Also, we also look at the more shorter term things. So our country has changed. Used to be very watery, and in the 1700s, when the economy in Holland was thriving, you see that the land was completely filled up. Water was taken out of society, and that continued for some time. So the landscape is changing. 1980 to 2010, this is the west part of the country. It's not Los Angeles and not New York, but still quite a lot of people. And you see that even though the population is increasing by 15%, the room we occupy is maybe double of what we occupied before because of the economy rising. So we occupy land which used to be natural, used to be used for example, storage of water. So there's lots of developments besides climate change and the way people look at things that are changing, and yeah, we have to anticipate to that. The system became less natural, and now you're actually trying to renaturalize our environment to a certain degree. So it's about shocks, but it's also about adapting to change. And it's not just climate. There's many more changes, urbanization. And Holland may not be that strong, but if you look at Asia, of course, that is a huge driver, much stronger than climate change at this stage. So it's about the economy, but also the way people look at the environment. People are much more vocal, and they don't just accept what civil engineers like me decide about their flood protection. They want to have a say. They don't want straight levees, which are just a levee. They want to, let's say, improve their direct environment also. So we have to listen. And then you see, because of that increase in communication between the more technical and societal people, that it's not about striving for a big goal, but it's about adaptation. It's about how to adapt to changing circumstances. You don't know exactly what's going to happen. There's not a clear new normal, I would say, because that was mentioned yesterday. But you know that things are changing, and you somehow have to adapt. You have to know actually when you have to do something. So in the Netherlands, we have lots of these hard structures, barriers. With sea level rise, they will become defunct. So when do we need to replace them, and when do we have to start preparing for that? There's a kind of technical thing, but all these kinds of decisions that you have to take if you want to adapt into the future. Okay. So I was mentioning that yeah, you want to adapt. You want to become more resilient, and you are not going to design only for the storm, but also for the normal conditions. And then you think about more green measures. Green measures are space. When you think about space, you move actually over the levee. So you move from the area where traditionally people like me were doing their work into areas where people are living. So you have to yeah, start communicating about it. You have to, oh, how do I get back? Okay. Okay. So you have to start coming up with solutions, and they have been presented also with the US cases. You have to come up with solutions that actually improve the living environment of people, to make them accept, to make them possible to finance them. And it's good to say that in a country like Holland, the private sector is really important. But if you think about flood protection, it's really government. Even insurance is sort of government. After the '53 flood, insurance companies backed out, because if there's a flood in the Netherlands, a big area will flood, and insurance companies will bankrupt. That was why, not bankrupt, but they will suffer a big blow. So in fact, the government is coming up with interventions, local government, federal government, but also is taking care of when something goes wrong, you're compensated. So that is more or less in one hand. So if you invest more in flood protection, you reduce the risk of having to pay out otherwise. So you're more or less balancing your budget. Okay, so about moving into inhabited areas. I will show you 3 examples. I'll go quickly through them. One on the coast, one on the rivers, and one in the city, where you see combinations of flood protection and improving the living environment of people. So here you look at the coast. This is a kind of, yeah, we try to label it as a kind of iconic project. We call it the Sand Engine. It's near The Hague. The Hague is the city where I live. This is a big nourishment, which actually protect the coast, but also it's surfing, well, there's a lot of surfing going on. So it's supporting tourism and recreation, whatever. That's also The Hague, but the more the central part, the urban area, where the levee needed to be improved, and it's combined with improving the whole waterfront of the city. So all kinds of other functions are incorporated in it. But still it's quite separate, city and sea, but you see that the combination makes it possible to actually finance it and also make it better for people that live in the city. I skipped another one, I see. This is on the river. This is the city of Nijmegen. We used to raise the levees, make them stronger all the time. And after the big floods in the 90s, we decided we're going to change the paradigm. We have to give more space to the river, room for the river. And this is one of the areas. On the left-hand side, there's the city of Nijmegen. On the right-hand side, we're planning big areas with new houses, where that water is now. And then the plan came to make the river wider there. So it was a big fight of the city and all the people there against making the river wider. Now it's built and it's there, and the people are extremely happy because it added a park to the city, more space, and you can also build houses somewhere else. You cannot put the river somewhere else. So this is a combination of actually reducing the levels in the river under big storms and creating extra green space in the city. And this is an example of Rotterdam, the city of Rotterdam, where we combine widening of the water courses in the river to accommodate for floods, and also another case that is a parking garage where water can be stored on top of the roof during storms and then let out. So you start to combine functions in the city. In the city it's even more important. So these are all solutions that combine, let's say, my work with living in a city. And then of course you have to communicate a lot about that, because solutions directly affect living environment of people. And it means that things like collaborative modeling, so what is the hazard actually, how are you protecting, and then talking about it at the right scale, so at the scale of a property, that people can actually imagine, oh, this does it do to my property. That becomes important. Looking at vulnerabilities, so what is actually happening if a flood happens. I put that picture on the right-hand side there because it might be peculiar to you. I thought it was maybe funny to mention, sort of. So our Minister of Infrastructure, the previous one, with all those people like me, we decided that everywhere in the Netherlands, the risk of dying from a flood should be less than once in 100,000. Of course, you can't really compute that, but that was said, and it means that we have to adapt our system to accommodate that. And it's a way of thinking, trying to harmonize the way you look at the country as a whole. So don't look at a particular spot only, but look at the country as a whole and use that kind of arbitrary norm as a guideline. This is my last slide. So what is actually the cause of the problem? What are the vulnerabilities? But then also you have to design and decide interactively. So that becomes also really important. You can do it with tools, but tools are just supporting. But it becomes more important, instead of coming out with the solution, discussing the solution and designing it together. That's what I wanted to say. Okay, thank you.
I need this as well. Good morning, everyone. I'm Sebastian Mell. I was appointed as Paris Chief Resilience Officer 2.5 years ago. And I'm going to tell you a few words about the water and river challenges in Paris. But I want to say at first that I'm not sure that I'm going to provide things that you don't know already, because since yesterday I've been learning a lot, and globally in France, the national government, we're far from the level of your reflection on these issues. So maybe you're going to find that our challenges are not that a big deal, but I tell you a few words about it. So we've been facing different river and water challenges in Paris. The first is a main flood. The last one occurred in 1910. But the territory, the city at this moment, was less vulnerable than now, much less. Because since we've been building critical networks, electricity, water, sewage, communication, underground, next to the river. Because at this time, in the past century, we were sure that we could find always a technical solution to protect ourselves. You know, it was the realm of the engineering sciences. Like we were sure that we were stronger than nature, that we could even go in another planet sometime if we had polluted too much this one, and we should have come, all of us, with flying cars right now. That's what we thought when I was a teenager. That's how we saw the future. But now the future is mainly this, and we're not ready. So we are not ready to face this big event. These numbers were raised by the OECD. And actually now we think that it's going to be worse. It's talking about 100 billion euros cost. And we're sure that it's going to happen. The question is just when. And to be politically correct, I could say we're not ready enough. And to be true, I could say we're not at all And so, don't tweet this, please, or could be fired. But that's a huge issue. But that's not the main one. The main one is exactly the reverse. We know that by the end of the century, the whole watershed is going to face a water scarcity. We already know it, and nothing is done yet to prepare this. So we're going to face long drought periods and more than all the competition around water between nuclear industry, agriculture, and drinkable water. And there is a third one, between both, cleaning up the river. This picture is not the river. It's a canal that is going to the river. But for the first time last year, it was open to the people for bathing. And that's one of the goals, especially for the Olympic Games, is to reconquest the natural quality of the water. Because we know that it's, most of the time the resilient solutions are just coming back about what we did before. And to face heat waves, and we know that we're going to face more and more heat waves in Paris, which is a mineral city. The last one was in June 17, 3 days of heat wave, 450 person died, elderly, just within 3 days of heat waves. And it's not considered so much as a main shock, but we need to refresh the city. So we have many solutions for that, but one of them is just to get back to what the people have been doing for centuries. It's warm, we're going into the water to get fresh. It's just easy, but the rivers have been polluted just since 100th century, 50 years. It's not that long. But it's huge about the consequences. So, in a resilience approach, what we've been doing is trying to, as it was said yesterday, to build solutions that are going to try to address the three challenges in the same time, and not a siloed approach. So what did we do since we've been working on resilience in Paris? Maire Hidalgo released the first Paris resilience strategy last October. It's an integrated strategy trying to address many challenges, including water. But if we're just regarding water, at first, we convinced that we needed to enlarge the scope. Because when I arrived, I met the people in charge of crisis management, and I saw, for instance, their mapping of flooding. So for the people who know, this could look weird for flooding. Like, what are these barriers? They are just the city borders. And so the city management was just considering flooding within the city borders. That's it. For both crisis management and building long-term solutions. So at first, no, of course. You've been saying that for 2 days, so it's not something new for you, but it is in France. The state, the national level, decided just 2 years ago to build the first reflection at the watershed level on this issue, because it was just managed city by city. So that's why, for instance, in Paris, we have dikes that are higher than in all the cities of the watershed, because we were richer. So when it's flooding, it's not flooding in Paris, but it's flooding upstream and downstream. What we decided to do is to think at the watershed level. And we built a historical cooperation, new one, with the countryside. Most of the capital cities have been developed themselves without taking too much into account the consequences of the development around them. And this is different. Now we've been considering that the resilience of Paris depends on the countryside, to feed the city, for instance, to reduce commuting and air pollution, and to manage flood risk. So we've been working with the countryside in this kind of, with just starting. We want to make deals with villages and with farmers all along the river to help them, even with money, to change the way they grow vegetables, for instance, to turn to organic growing and so on, because we want to reconquest the quality of the river. We'll need some time to flood their cultures to protect the city, so we need to have this kind of win-win situation, because in the win-win thing is that we're going to buy their vegetables for our schools and so on, and it can come by the river on electric boats. And we're not going to increase air pollution. We've been working, thanks to 100 resident cities platform partner, on a mapping that is going to help us to deal for each part of the territory with the farmers, the local authorities, because in France we have, I think it's a word example, we have 35,000 municipalities. And each has a mayor, and so governance is a mess, and it is a huge issue regarding this risk. Of course, we need to better anticipate events, because we had this, I'm saying that in the last century, all the authorities, national, city ones, were doing like the three monkeys about this risk, like, hopefully it won't occur while I'm elected. This is for the next one, not for me. And so it was not considered as a main risk or as an issue. So of course we want to better anticipate. So that's one of the action of the resilience strategy, and we are getting inspired by what was done by Rebuild by Design in New York City, the rebuilding of New Orleans, and we want to use this kind of way of thinking to anticipate the risk and the recovery, because we'll need 5 to 10 years to recover about the flood. And the third thing, counting on people. This is completely new. People are not aware about the risk of flood. And it's changing now, because Maire Hidalgo, she's chair of the C40, she's really committed in this, in finding solution to face risks and all that stuff. But before, the leitmotif was, you won't be re-elected talking to the people about catastrophes. So just don't tell them. Don't tell them, don't prepare them, we'll see. But if you tell them, it's not sexy enough to talk about catastrophe to be re-elected. But we've been changing that. And we've been involving the people. Where do you live? Do you know what is going to happen? Are you ready? Are you prepared? Do you have a plan B to go somewhere else, and so on? This is completely new, and it's thanks to the resilience approach. And last, my last slide, I want to say that the power of the resilience is this integrated and holistic approach. And so we need to think river and water management, whatever the project is. And I just taking one example. One of the flagship action of Paris Resilience Strategy is to transform our 700 schoolyards into cool oases. So we've been changing the material, we've been doing greening, providing shadow, water in all the schoolyards in order to both guarantee the better condition of education to the children, whatever are the consequences of climate change, and to offer refuges for elderly and vulnerable people during heat waves, because that's the most dense urban facilities that we have in the city. So no Parisian is living further than 200 meters from a school, so we're going to use the school for multiple benefits. And what we've been doing here is just changing this ground that is made traditionally with concrete, asphalt, and it's totally impervious, into permeable stuff, and this is going to help us a lot to face this flooding risk. This is just one action among tens, and as I didn't have that much time, I'm stopping here. Thank you very much.
Hello, I'm Arnoldo Matus. I'm the Chief Resilience Officer of Mexico City. And well, I will tell you a little bit of the challenges that we face in Mexico City around water, which are multiple risks. But first, 2 minutes of history of Mexico City and our relation with water. The Aztec Empire, Tenochtitlan, was founded actually in an island. And we have still some remainings of the lake past within the city. It has been degraded. We have become one of the largest cities in the world. But that's 700 years of history. We will do that in 2 minutes. But basically, it's the risk of flooding during the Spanish colonization period started a process of diverting the water and desiccating the lake that was part of the city in ancient times. And then in the 20th century, we had a very explosive population growth. The city grew from 1 million people to today's 22 million inhabitants. And this is something that is happening today in many cities in Asia and Africa. And so, in a way, I think that Mexico City is a very important resilience hub in terms of understanding critical risks around water and an increasing population growth and urbanization process. So today, we import a lot of our water, like from different basins coming from the Pacific, and then we use a lot of our aquifer, local aquifer. We are overexploiting very hardly our local aquifer. There is a lot of uncertainty in terms of how many years we will have 50% of our potable water coming from the aquifer. So some scientists say maybe in the next 30 years or to 50 years we will run out of the local aquifer supply of water, which is one of the main challenges in terms of resilience and the future of the city. And this is also related with our use of the land. So we have identified already areas which are critical for the recharge of the aquifer, but in those areas, which is Mexico City, actually the territory is divided by conservation land and urban areas. And in the conservation areas, that's where we have the recharge of the aquifer, but we have still some illegal settlements in those areas that are growing. So we are losing that capacity to recharge of our aquifer. And this is an issue of national security because we are 22 million people in the metropolitan area, but the surrounding cities, it's a conglomeration that in 2030 we will be around 30 million people. So it's quite critical if we face a situation like in California with the droughts or Cape Town today because of the level of population that we have in the region. And this is also related to other risks. So overexploiting our aquifer, what causes is subsidence, high subsidence levels, and we are in an earthquake-prompt area. So the soil conditions and the subsidence affecting our risk profile to earthquakes, which it's in some of the areas that we have highest subsidence levels, we experience high vulnerability in the last earthquake. So that's also a relation in terms of resilience. And for sure, I mean, we are at risk of flooding. This is a scenario where we have a failure on our main drainage system. But guess what? Which is the infrastructure there in our areas with the largest risk of flooding? It's our current airport, the new airport, the historical center, the financial center, and at the same time we face risk of droughts as well. In 2009, 2010, in the center of Mexico, there was a drought period, and our levels of the basins that are supporting Mexico City's water supply, our reserves were declining, and then suddenly we had some hurricanes in the Pacific, and we retake the levels of water, but this was already causing some water cuts within some of the neighborhoods in Mexico City, which for sure caused severe social conflict within the city. So for that, we have different initiatives. This is not a unique strategy that can solve many of these issues, but some of the key initiatives, for example, we have a new water fund, which is a collaboration with the private sector, the universities, the international community, and the city the city government, and there is multiple projects for water security to protect the area of the conservation area where we can recharge the aquifer. We have soon probably the redevelopment of the international airport of Mexico City, and we are pushing to have as much green infrastructure as possible to change the paradigm on how we manage water within the city. The areas of the remainings of the lake, Xochimilco, which is a natural heritage site and cultural heritage site, so how we can regenerate these areas in terms of our relation with water and the ancient culture that we have around that. Basically, in terms of our resilience goals is first to reduce water scarcity and poverty around water, because on the periphery of Mexico City, those people that are not connected to the potable water network are the ones that are paying most for the water, because they are getting their water through buses, for example. So they pay much more for getting their water, but also to promote a sustainable use of the aquifer. And to do that, we need to have metrics on how to do this. Otherwise, it's not realistic. There is, in many plans within the city, on the climate change program, the resilience strategy, we say that we want to have a sustainable use of the aquifer, but without particular goals with metrics and indicators and a robust monitoring system, that's just in paper. So we are trying to move into having a conversation with the scientists on how to monitor well the aquifer, and as well to establish metrics in terms of how we are going to move into sustainability around the aquifer, and also to move into green infrastructure and blue infrastructure within the city to change the paradigm of a very centralized system to a more decentralized system. Here are some examples of projects that are already happening in terms of green infrastructure to avoid flooding. Some of them are inspired by our friends from Rotterdam and the Netherlands, and also some recent discussions about the impact of the earthquake in the water system. It was some of the main system that was affected through the earthquake was related to water, so breaks in the potable water network and also in the sewage system because of the earthquake. So we know that we face a high vulnerability of our water system to earthquakes, but we need to start working for the next earthquake and how we can build seismic resilience for our water system. And with that, I conclude. Thank you.
Thank you, Arnoldo, Sebastian, Karel. Things familiar to most of you in some way or another, some unique challenges. Sebastian mentioned governance. In the Netherlands, you have a system of this is an existential question. How do you deal with water? If they don't deal with it well, they're moving to Germany. It's a fact of life, and they don't want to do that. How do they maintain that economy? So here you have a strong government. People trust the government to move this forward with under certain conditions. In Paris, 35,000. What do you have? You have all these mayors, 27 mayors. How many mayors?
We have 20 district mayors at the district level, but we have 27 deputy mayors.
27. Okay.
Deputy, and I have to deal with all of them.
Right. So, so governance. It's a challenge. It's a challenge in the U.S. One of the things that we have done, what I have done in the past is, we have uncovered these stovepipes in policy and funding that are really hampering the implementation, the design and engineering and implementation of resilience projects or projects with infrastructure projects with multiple benefits. And we've seen that over the entire US. And this is a challenge, and I don't see us solving it very quickly, and yours doesn't look any better. And Arnoldo, here you have this this fast-growing city, indicative of what's going to happen in other places. I can't imagine that resilience or sustainability or your work is the highest priority of anyone in the city except for you and the people you convince, because you have all these other challenges. So governance, how do you, each reflect upon this, how do you involve the stakeholders? So you have all these players, government, non-government, nonprofit, citizens, private companies, private experts. How do you involve them to move this discussion forward? Where are your successes? Where are your failures? Where are your frustrations? And then what would you recommend? You heard enough here yesterday and this morning. What would you recommend to us?
I'm not going to recommend you anything, but no, it's yeah. How do you involve the stakeholders? Of course, I'm a bit of a technical person, but you can't involve somebody if he doesn't understand the problem. And if you talk about big events, it's very difficult to know what might happen, and it has been talked about in the previous session also. So somehow, and the current technique gives you that kind of possibilities. You have to kind of visualize, make people imagine what a flood may do to their house. And although we are below sea level, etc., we don't have much flooding. So people don't experience it, for example, that their father was in a big flood. It might have been if he was living in the south of the country, but generally they don't. So you could use modern techniques, simulation, to show people what to do, to trigger the discussion and how interventions might influence their living environment. We have much less of budget discussions like you have, because flood protection is a kind of commodity. How do you call it? Like water from the tap and electricity. So it has to happen, otherwise, indeed, we don't exist. And we don't want to lose our football team when moving to Germany. Soccer team, sorry. European making a mistake here. But yeah, that is the way you see. And people more or less have a hand in, let's say, developing a solution. They are more likely to accept it also later on, or object it for good reasons, because that might happen too.
I'd say as well that pedagogy is really important to convince both inside the local government and with external stakeholders. But that's one of the strengths of the resilience approach compared to the sustainable one, for instance. As it's holistic, whatever is the topic regarding flooding, you can convince people in charge of public spaces, greening the city, social, that they have to do something regarding water. And the difference is that instead of saying, I'm going to add actions to your to-do list that is already completely busy, because you have to be resilient after being sustainable, and inclusive, and smart, and so on. So the real people working in the city, you know, they just see us like dreamers and stuff because they are delivering the real public service on a daily basis. And we are preparing future, but that's not their business. Except if we prove them that it is. And so we're not saying, I'm going to ask to add something to your to-do list. We are telling them, can I see your to-do list? What do you have to do this year on your department? And we're going to embed resilience and water management in it. And you can convince that water management or flood management is a way to transform public spaces into cool islands, to better manage the city finances, because it's going to cost a lot, to involve the children in the schools about the global cycle of the water in a pedagogical way, and so on. So it's interesting for schools and the education department as well, and so on, and so on. And so the idea is really to prove that this holistic approach can provide multiple benefits, whatever is the entrance door. It can be the water, it can be inequity, it can be in Paris terrorism, it can be, but that's the strength of this approach.
Well, I would add, in terms of water in Mexico City, we are facing like a paradigm conflict. In terms of, for years, for hundreds of years, the city has been in a trend of bringing big infrastructure projects, a very engineering approach. And in the resilience strategy, what we identify is like, well, there is a new community of people, designers, architects, urbanists, that would like to integrate more decentralized system with more green infrastructure, a restoration of part of our superficial lake system and rivers that we used to have within the city. And so the decision there, it was, well, there was a gap where there was no leadership in terms of facilitating a process where we could establish a dialogue with that paradigm and the new paradigm. So we have been working hard in terms of building a coalition of different organizations from NGOs, the universities, even the private sector, to start a dialogue with the water authorities in terms of this new paradigm. And I think in the last 3 years we have really achieved a change in terms of the dialogue, and we now sit in the same table, and we are moving to start discussing about real projects, but also questioning how we have done things in the past decades. But it's a commitment. You have to take a commitment, and it's a long-term commitment. It's something that we will not solve from 1 year to the other. It will take decades to have a new approach on water management in the city.
Thank you. I want to dig a little bit deeper. So you're building a coalition and you're getting people at the same table. The Dutch have this thing they call the Polder model where they try to do this. But what tool or what carrot or what stick did you use to do that? How did you drive that discussion? Again, given your context of this fast-growing city trying to absorb a lot of things and provide service for a lot of people without probably sufficient resources. So what tools did you use? And Karel mentioned this, and we've seen it. Do these tools, decision support tools or visualization tools, Ehab said yesterday, Dr. Masali said yesterday about the models that we use, they have to be accurate and reliable and legitimate. That's true, but they also be able to convey information to certain people. And as we deal with citizens and all these people that are involved in these decisions, so your coalition, your 27 deputy mayors, your public utility departments you're dealing with in their capital improvement budgets on a yearly basis. You're trying to influence that, like, okay, create this resilience paragraph within your capital improvement budgets, programs. Karel, with these tools, what are you using there to influence the outcome of those processes? What tools? And what works and what doesn't?
Well, in our experience, we are building those tools at the moment. One critical issue in Mexico City is the lack of sometimes of data and the lack of sharing data between the different organizations. So that's a critical barrier. One critical project that we are doing in this regard is with the World Bank. So with the World Bank and the University of Massachusetts, we are integrating a model that takes into account the different basins that supply water to Mexico City, but also the metropolitan area. And we are assessing the portfolio of investments with a resilience lens in order to prioritize the investments with a resilience lens. And one of the conversations with the World Bank in terms of changing the paradigm, it was to open up the conversation, not just with the water authorities, but with other stakeholders, in order to bring other potential actions to the table, like, let's say, more green infrastructure or the protection of the conservation areas, and not just bringing the portfolio of engineering solutions, and then to test those in terms of resilience lens. So that's one of the tools that we are using to discuss with the different stakeholders around bringing a resilience lens into water management.
I want to give an example of a missing tool in Paris. We can modelize quite easily the flooding of because of course I didn't say that in Paris the flood is it's not a coastal flood, because Paris is not yet a coastal city. Maybe in a couple of centuries if global warming is getting really fast, but so far it's not, and it's a slow kinetics, is it correct in English? So the water is growing slowly but stays for more than a month before getting out. And we can modelize easily the surface flooding, but not at all the underground water, what's happening about the water underground. And Paris is a French-Swiss cheese with its underground. We have 7 layers. And so what does that mean? to have the modelization about what's happening on surface if you don't add what's happening underground. It's just something false. It makes me think about the FEMA stuff we saw yesterday. So we can't count on this modelization so far. So we've been trying to convene, and actually it's working not too bad. The different stakeholders in charge of the underground, there are 10, like parking owners, metro energy providers, and so on. But they never, so far, they don't want to share the data. They have these meters and sensors, but there is not an integrated approach. They are not connected to each other because they've been saying that it's a commercial and industrial secret because it's talking about their vulnerabilities. So they don't want this data to be open. And that's a crucial need we have, and that's one more time a question of stakeholders' involvement.
Jeff will tell you that that was part of the challenge in New Orleans, is understanding the groundwater, surface water interaction, and then just developing the solution for that. So I'm sure there are some people in the room here who may be willing to collaborate with you on that. So for that
and Dale, I think we'd like to move into some audience engagement in a moment. If you...
Okay, please.
Thank you for a great discussion. I'll direct my question at Mr. Kramer, but I think I'd be interested to hear from all of you. This discussion about the change in the approach in water management more generally to include more green infrastructure and integrated solutions. You mentioned your partnership with the World Bank. I'm curious how you feel this change has permeated within the funding institutions, World Bank, BID, other partners who have historically focused on infrastructure and the nexus between the funding agencies and the governments. These projects spend a lot of money, right? So it's large loans, large infrastructure projects, support large business enterprises. How have you seen that conversation change with the funding agency to help focus on not always gray, hard infrastructure?
Yeah, I think, well, the conversation is that still green infrastructure is just a short part of the general budget on water. That's the reality. But in a place where you don't have almost any big green infrastructure project, I think the World Bank has been quite useful into, it's very respected institution, so it was easier for us, which we are like a new institution, to open the doors with the water authorities, no? and to try to bring other stakeholders that have a different mindset into conversations with the main stakeholders that have most of the resources. And it's an issue of, you have to have a constant dialogue, because the objectives of the water authority are very different from some of the objectives related to green infrastructure. So it's in their mindset, many green infrastructure projects, they don't achieve what their goals are, which are supply water for everyone within the very large metropolis. So once you start thinking about the other co-benefits, it's not in their equation. So that's why you need to bring very different stakeholders to the tables to sustain a different approach.
I would just add, I have a discussion on Monday with folks from the World Bank about collaborative stakeholder approaches and how that was done in the US in places where we worked, and then whether that's transferable to other places, because it is often top-down. But also, the World Bank tends to prefer gray infrastructure because it's proven the benefit cost analysis is easy to do, but they are opening their ears to more green infrastructure, natural and nature-based solutions. It will take some time, I think, just because of the way the funding mechanisms work.
I think it's also, there's the knowledge about hybrid solutions, gray and green together, it's not, let's say, it needs to be further developed. And I think, for example, the work you do here in the Delta, which is the kind of biggest laboratory of green infrastructure, or gray and green together, or what can happen if you apply gray infrastructure and don't incorporate all the consequences. I think these kind of projects, the work you do here, might provide examples on what you should or what you shouldn't do. And so I think it's developing. And in a city, green infrastructure in a city with high pressures like Jakarta, where the project developers take up every space, maybe the thinking could be that there should be green infrastructure, but the price of land is so high that you just lose it. So you have to work with nature maybe in another way, but it's not always possible, especially not in developing countries.
Good morning. Oh, this is loud. My name is Thomas. I work with Sasaki Associates, a planning and design-oriented company out of Boston. And my question is to the whole panel. We've heard a lot over the last 1.5 days about, we have to basically come up, what is the problem? What is the big problem, and how do we challenge that problem? We heard about a lot of the metrics, about the data, the different tools that we have to sort of visualize these issues and how we communicate them. We've heard about the leadership and the partnerships that we create to then translate some of these territorial issues that we have down into a city or into a very specific place. I'm curious to hear from you guys where you see or what the value of planning and specifically also then design is exactly in that setting where you translate territorial issues, even though it's one part of a river that is obviously has its origins upstream. Where do you see the value of design within what you do on a daily basis, and how do you bring that knowledge or that value in by communicating this big thing down to, let's say, the community outreach and whatnot?
At first, I would say that we've been considering several problems in the same time, and there is not one problem that we're going to address, but many problems that are interdependent, and we need at first to see problems together to try to build solutions that are going to address as much as possible of them. And then, to give Paris example, we've been using more and more design to try to find solutions. And we've been inspired by Rotterdam. And what was presented earlier, especially the rainwater management in Rotterdam with these water squares, Bentemplein, and so on. The way they were designed, including the stakeholders on the long term, that's exactly what we copied in Paris for our schoolyard program. It's not the same topic, it's not the same infrastructures, but it's the same process, the same way of thinking. And we are totally convinced that the design thinking approach can really help to align the stakeholders, actually, which is most of the time the most important. Most of the time we're not facing technical issues. We'll find technical solutions. But to align the stakeholders is not that easy, and the way the design is doing it is really helpful, in Paris example at least.
I think also, like Sébastien said, I think design is really important because if people, okay, you may solve a water problem somewhere, but if you do it in a very pleasing way, it might provide a prototype and encourage people developers to do it somewhere else too. I think Rotterdam examples, but also this boulevard in Scheveningen, I think you find it in many cities, you will have them here too. If people like what is the result of a particular project because they like to be in that space, I think it really helps to apply these kind of approaches somewhere else too. It will cost maybe a little bit more money, but I think, talking about in American terms, maybe the value of property will also rise. So, I don't know, I'm not an economist, but I think it's really important.
Yeah, and well, just to close, in my experience, like it's so important the design. For example, in the case of Mexico, where we had this historical relation with water and a culture around water, but that has been broken in the last 60, 70 years. design is a solution to get back at our relation with water, for example, and that could be provided through the public space with water components. And we have areas in the city that are in need of creative design and also co-design with the communities. And that's something that we are still starting to do within the Resilience Agency, and we still have a whole process to learn about how to co-design with the communities and bring them to the table from an early stage of the process.
And I'll add this. I'm an economist, so I can look at a spreadsheet and find a lot of pleasure in that. But it is not until you turn it into a bar graph or a pie chart or some sort of visualization that other people can approach it and grasp the message. And so, a shorter story, I was co-director of the Dutch Dialogues in New Orleans. We started that with folks on there because people weren't dealing with the urban water. They were looking at the coast, they were looking at the perimeter protection post-Katrina, but they weren't looking at the urban water. And what does that mean? And we worked with, the other co-founders, David Wagoner, an architect, designer. We worked with the design process, and we brought the engineers and the biologists and the planners in. And that iterative process, back and forth, we do the designers trying to visualize these dreams or ideas or designs, technical designs from the engineers or ideas, and then putting that into an image created awareness and knowledge amongst all the people in that process. It also allowed the end result to be communicated to stakeholders, to citizens, to understand what was going on. And design also creates a vision. It's this thing at the end, or this thing you work towards. And engineers love them to death, but they have often a finite problem, and they solve that finite problem very, very, very well. But they don't lift their eyes off the horizon. And designers, sometimes they only look at the horizon. And it's this space in between where things get done. And so I think design is crucial in this with all the other related design disciplines, plus the engineers, plus the planners. And you need to respect the design process, needs to respect the political reality. And I think Houston's, so I'll mention this again, the Houston, the Bayou Greenways 2020 program is an awesome example of how this works. And to your question is, these things, when they're done well, they create more value. The land, the utility for the economy, for people, it's much higher than it was when you do that in that integrated fashion.
I think we've got time for one more question.
I have a question about an emergent population that's getting more attention in the resilience dialogue, and that's the population of tourists who come to the city, who won't have the innate knowledge of the population who resides there with all the great public and neighborhood outreach that you'll be doing with those neighbors. I understand that the World Tourism Organization conference this year brought tourism forward with resilience for one of the first times. And I'm really interested to hear, given the expertise in all these cities, the way in which you're thinking of engaging that population and the population that supports them in order to help them understand how their actions can contribute to the resilience strategy, and also what to do in case there's an event.
As Paris is the first touristy destination in the world, I can give a couple of examples. We've been working not with the tourists, but with the tourism industry for a couple of years, especially after the terrorist attacks, actually, in Paris, because tourism is a huge part of Paris economy, as you can imagine, and the economic consequences of the terrorist attack are huge. We're talking about billions after each terrorist attack. So it's a huge issue. And so we started to work with the tourism industry. There was a huge summit about tourism in Berlin, like Hospitality Inside or something like that, that focused on resilience and tourism last year. For the first time, I was invited to talk about Paris issues. It's complicated, because this population is really difficult to catch. And in Paris, we've been trying to advocate for one thing. It's the minimum. Emergency management in case of major terrorist attack or flood or whatever. But one more time, France is quite late because, you know, we've been advocating for the cell broadcast system that is working here, I guess, but not at all in France, because the government couldn't manage the negotiation with the phone operators. And so if you want to be informed if there is something, the national police tells you to download an app which is in French only, that nobody knows, nobody downloaded, and it was used just once since it exists for a fake alert. And that's it at the moment. And so every time I'm meeting the people in charge of it at the national level, I'm telling them, but we are so late compared to the other countries regarding this. But as you may know, the French administration is probably the most siloed that exists in the world, except maybe North Korea or I don't know. But and so the cities are really moving a lot at the moment in France. And the future has been created in cities, while at the national level it's really freezed.
Well, I think it's a problem because it's a constant flow of tourists. So it's like what has worked in Mexico is like surveillance cameras and the reaction of the police force in any type of emergency. I mean, we have around 20,000 cameras already, which has increased the efficiency of the emergency response within the city. I don't know if that's a lesson to export to every city, because I mean the level of infrastructure that you need to have is very sophisticated. It's a lot of investment to have such an infrastructure. So for smaller cities, I don't know if the finance it's there. But that's something that Mexico has done in the last 15 years, let's say.
I think we don't do anything about it. The only thing we do is, with respect to flooding, is we take them to our old flood management systems, the mills, and earn some money from the tourists. But we don't really do that. I think in countries with flash floods and with tornadoes and so these rapid events, I think it's really important. But these slow upcoming floods, somehow it's for the own population, but not for the tourists.
It's a version of your question, but one of the things that Garrett Graves and folks from Louisiana noticed, and other folks noticed when we took them to the Netherlands, was that the Netherlands, when they build infrastructure, they build a visitor center next to it. And so the citizens can come and see that sand motor thing that Karel showed. There's a little visitor center there. It's just a little pop-up shack, but it's still there with information in it. And people learn. The tourists go there too. They have a major visitor center and some of these barriers that are well visited, not only by citizens, but by tourists. And what's happening there is it's conveying to people that this is an issue. We need to do this, and this is what it costs, and this is what it gives us, and this is how it works. That's just good education for anyone coming in. And I think the city of Rotterdam, surely, under C40 and 100 resilient cities, and Amsterdam, given all the other pleasures that it brings, they have benefited tremendously from showcasing this technology and this idea. And meanwhile, here in Louisiana, all the infrastructure that is there, that's all the investment that we taxpayers paid, that's down there protecting New Orleans now, is not visible. And that's a missed opportunity. So that's sort of my take on that. It's a missed opportunity for education. Okay, good. So we're getting this eager to wrap up, and I want to please join me in thanking the panelists for an awesome presentation. And I'll just remind you that Sebastian said, please do not tweet the things he says. Thank you.